All right, I'm ready when you are.
All right, we're recording, and welcome everybody. Those of you who are watching or joining us live, and those of you who are watching the recording, thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. Edwin, unfortunately, cannot join us tonight, but I'm sure he'll come back whenever he can. Hopefully next week. But tonight, I'm gonna lead the discussion over the Book of Micah. Micah's I would say Micah's the most famous for the prophecy about the Messiah coming from Bethlehem. But besides that, there's a whole context, and it's a very interesting and short and sweet little book. So as for the background, quickly, Micah is, as you can see in the beginning of chapter 1, he's from a small town of Moresheth, and that's in the southern kingdom of Judah, kind of like our previous prophets, like Amos, who rose from southern Judah, got the calling, and prophesied against the evils of their days. Micah is much the same, and as for the time period, he lived about the same time as Isaiah, which is about 8th century BC, under the reigns of Jotham, or Jotham, and Ahaz and Hezekiah. We know Jotham and Hezekiah as relatively good, righteous kings, but Ahaz, not so much. And by this time, the northern and southern kingdoms have been split for quite a while now. And throughout the book, Micah will address Samaria or Jacob or Israel, and those refer to the two kingdoms. When he says Samaria, obviously that's referring to the capital city of the northern Israel, and I would say that is representative of the whole northern kingdom. Or when he says Jerusalem or Jacob, he's obviously referring to southern Judah. And really, Micah is prophesying not just against the northern kingdom, which we usually associate the northern kingdom as evil and rebellious, but also to the southern kingdom. So really, just the whole people of Israel, Micah is pointing out and accusing of certain evils that we'll get into very soon. And overall, the violation is the people of Israel's violation against the covenant of God, their relationship with God, and their unfaithfulness towards it. And Micah prophesies that Assyria, the first invasion, will ravage both nations. We know that this actually does happen later on down the history. And after them, the Babylonian exile that will soon follow after. And Micah, like other prophets, speaks on behalf of God of these accusations and warnings for the people of Israel. It's not just accusations, they're warnings, and also he gives a glimpse of hope. And we'll see that in the structure of Micah, I believe, when we get into that. I think in terms of that, a verse that is very telling of Micah's purpose and drive for in this book is in chapter 3, verse 8. It says, "I am filled with strength, with the Spirit of God, and with justice and power to declare how Israel has rebelled." And he does that. He does that. He does exactly that. And so, therefore, the book of Micah is a series of accusations and warnings against Israel. Not just the northern kingdom either, but to really anyone who this applies to. And certainly southern Judah was not exempt from these accusations. They had their shortcomings too. And the interesting thing to note, and we've been seeing this pattern throughout our study in the minor prophets so far, is that even the harshest books, like Hosea, for example, does not leave out. Sorry.
Or Amos as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Even the most accusatory and harsh and punishing books, messages against the evil doings of Israel, the message of hope is not left out. There's always the purpose of these messages is clear, in that it's not to point out the flaws just for the sake of punishment or just for the sake of accusation, but you can see the purpose behind these messages, and God speaking to his nation, his people through these prophets, is that he wants them to turn back, that there is hope, that there is a chance to earn forgiveness. Well, not earn, but to repent and beg for forgiveness, and God will take you back. God, still loves you, and he is defined by his steadfast love, his mercy and compassion. And this message, obviously, is also present in Micah, and I think we'll see that when we get on. And you can especially see this, like we were talking about, in chapter 4 and 5.
Yeah, we have to remind ourselves, and the similarity that you point out is awesome. With whether it's Hosea, Amos, or Micah, the interjection of the prophet's message is because sin has already been occurring. The guilt has already accumulated. These practices were already in place. It's a loving response by God to stand in that gap with these prophets and say, you need to turn this around. Now, I think Micah, like some of the others, and I'm sure you'll get to this, has embedded in the message, God's loving kindness. You've gone beyond, and so that there's a judgment that you're going to have to incur. But on the other side of that, I want you. This is what I want for you. I don't want your total destruction. I want a chance for restoration and relationship. And
Yeah.
Micah's going to have that same feature.
Yeah, and you really see that in Micah in the concluding, last 2-3 verses, and we'll definitely focus on that later. But yeah, so the structure of Micah is it's pretty straightforward. It's not overly complicated. It's very it's simply laid out. I don't know how you would do it, but I personally outlined it. I grouped chapter 1 and 2 together, and then chapter 3 and about the first half of 4 together. And from the last half of 4 to chapter 5, that's where you get the the visuals, the visions about God's kingdom, and the prophecy about the new Jerusalem and God's restoration of his people. And in chapter 6 and 7, the last 2 chapters, I think it goes back. It's almost like a summary. It mirrors the structure of the first 4 chapters. And at the very end, you get this conclusive, hopeful message about God's love and steadfastness.
Yeah. My outline is 3 points. It's judgment in chapters 1 through 3, some a little broader in my breakdown. Comfort in chapters 4 and 5, and the way of salvation in chapters 6 through 7. You start with where they were and what they needed to do, and then, and especially toward the end, what God is providing as a light and salvation and so forth. But I like yours. I'd like to have a copy of your outline.
Okay. One of the main reasons I divided it up like that is because at the ends of these first 2 sections, and this is mirrored in the last two chapters also. You have this kind of negative and accusatory message against the people of Israel. But at the end of that section, end of those sections, you get this glimpse of hopeful message. And I don't know, that's how I did it. But I think that's an interesting thing to look at. So starting with chapter 1 and 2, I titled this as God's judgment. And it's a poetic visual of God appearing to his people, right? It's almost like the scene in at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19 and 20, when God appears to his people in order to give them, his commandments, his laws. But ironically, this scene is a little different, because God's not appearing to make a covenant or renew the covenant, but rather he is appearing in order to enact his justice, enact his judgment upon his people. Because so far, like we said, Israel has not upheld their end of the deal, their end of the covenant with God. They have, they have violated their covenantal relationship with God due to their unfaithfulness. And Micah names different towns and cities of Israel, and they are responsible for rebelling against God. And of course, this is not a comprehensive list of all the cities or all the towns, and we can't say that these are the specific cities and they're the only ones that sinned, but rather I think this is just a poetic representation, a synecdoche, if you will.
Are you looking at verses 10 through 16, those cities?
Yes.
But did you notice what he's done there with those names? Are you going to deal with that? It's pretty cool.
No, can you?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's a series of puns in verses 10 through 16. Each one of those cities, look in verse 10 where he says Beth Leafra, that actually means house of dust. So let the house of dust roll yourself in the dust.
Okay.
In verse 11, Shafir is pleasantness. You who are pleasant, you're going to be shamefully naked. And every one of those cities, their name means what he's referring to here, and they are real cities.
Right.
But it's incredible to me that the Holy Spirit through Micah is driving home a point of judgment by saying, you house of dust, you're going to be dust.
Yeah.
You pleasant place, you're going to be shameful and naked. So Zanin as well is or it means going out. The inhabitant of going out does not go out. The lamentation of Beth Ezel is the place of support. He will take from you at support. So every one of these, you read that with that in mind, is what it means there. Because I've been to Lachish, for example, in verse 13. These are real cities, but he's driving it home. So there's some poetry, some irony, some puns that are used, as you say, very symbolic.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a good example of someone like me missing that nuance that you really can't get unless you really study the original language. But thank you for pointing that out. I don't know. That went way over my head. But yeah, that's and Micah is using this device to point out and accuse these cities and its people of their sins. It's poetic, but to the end of pointing out their sins and setting the tone of accusation and you did wrong in this covenantal relationship with God. Now, later on down in chapter 2, we start to see the specifics of these accusations, and it provides the why, the answer to the why of that we've been asking in the previous chapter, in chapter 1, with all these cities and all these people. Why are they being accused? Why is Micah coming at him like that? And in chapter 2, you can see Micah accuses two main groups, at least that I've seen. He accuses leaders and accuses prophets, and those two are representative of secular leadership and spiritual leadership, right? So really, he is hitting all of leadership in general in the among the Israelites, the secular ones, the political ones, and the spiritual ones. And these secular leaders, right, these political leaders, they have grown wealthy by stealing from their own people and his neighbors. And this really reminded me of Ahab when he murdered Naboth to steal his vineyard in First Kings, I think chapter 21. And they are overcome by greed so much that they are willing to raise their hands against their own people.
And lie and do everything that they can to take possession.
Yeah, taking bribes. And it's interesting because and we'll hit on it later on in chapter 32. But these are specific. These aren't just arbitrary accusations. They are things that are listed out in the Torah, the laws of God, and that these people are actively violating and being unfaithful with. So and the prophets, right, who are supposed to be the moral compass, the spiritual compass of these nations. Even when the political leaders fail, the prophets are supposed to be the check and balance for these people, and yet they are in moral depravity. And it specifically says, let's see, and verse 11, if a man should go out and utter winds and lies, saying, I will preach to you wine and strong drink, he would be the preacher for this people. These supposed spiritual leaders are prophesying against God, against the laws of God, against the statutes of the Lord, but rather for people who are willing to pay, people who are willing to give them power, people who are willing to pass things by. So it's just total moral and spiritual depravity, and really Micah is just hitting it right on the head, and he's accusing them of these very specific violations.
David, there's this totality that's seen in both chapter 1 and chapter 2, and it's not just in chapter 1. But you mentioned Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem, the capital of the southern kingdom. But if Samaria goes down, there goes the northern kingdom, and if Jerusalem goes down, there goes down the southern kingdom. When it comes to their leaders and their prophets, if they are depraved, what do you expect that the people are going to be? And so,
exactly.
We can't rise or fall. We will rise or fall no more or less than our leaders. And
right.
So they're the pace setters, and they're not
exactly.
setting the pace here.
Yeah, and again, I think this is more or less a poetic device that Micah is using, where he is taking the like you said, they are the hallmarks of, they are that's how we gauge a society by its leaders and by its the people who are in charge, people who are in power. And Micah is using that, I believe, to not only just accuse those specific groups of people, but rather the entirety of the people of God. You're right. Great point. So we move on, and we'll come back to the hopeful messages of the ends of these two sections. We'll hit on that, but for now, let's go on to chapter 3 and through chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 4. And like I mentioned, and these are specific accusations. These are not arbitrary. This isn't just he said, she said, right? This is active violations against the laws and statutes that God has set for the nation of Israel. And this is in like Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23, or Numbers chapter 36 and verse 7. You can't, just because you have power, just because you have money, and just because you have the means to do it, you can't neglect and violate and steal from your poor neighbors, your neighbors that are vulnerable, your fellow men who are, I guess, in their socioeconomics standing, are more vulnerable to be able to be exploited and taken advantage of. And this really is a trend in the prophets, because God is not just concerned about, well, he is concerned about the soul of man. He is concerned about the spiritual, but those things cannot be separated from the real, the justice that can be done in real life, the righteousness that has to be seen in our actions, in our lives, in our physical lives, right? So I think that's a very interesting thing to note, is that here in Micah, like the other minor prophets that we've studied so far, here yet again is another example of justice that can be enacted upon, justice that can be tangible in people's lives. And right here, Micah's accusations are that Israel so far, or the people of Israel rather, so far has failed because they take advantage and exploit their poor neighbors, their more vulnerable people, the widows and orphans, right?
And I don't think it's even just an Old Testament issue. I think about walk through Luke in the Gospels,
Yeah.
and you'll see such an emphasis that Luke gives on the careless rich or the oppressed poor. You have the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich farmer, and you have Zacchaeus' behavior, and you have all these different characters, and then you get to James. In James chapter 1, verse 27, pure religion is equated to taking care of that helpless groups of people that can't take care of themselves. And we talk about faith without works is dead, being alone. And we apply, and I think it's a good application to make to faith only won't save you. But what's James's example? It's taking care of physical needs of your brother. 1 John 3:14, we say we love God and we shut up our heart against our brother. How does the love of God dwell in us? Be warm and filled, and we don't give them the things that they need. So it's really a timeless problem that Micah's dealing with, that we might struggle with today. And I don't necessarily mean the person who's standing on the corner holding up a sign, if we're a little suspicious of how genuine they may be. But God gives us an abundance of opportunities, and there are people he puts in our path that he expects us, whether they obey the gospel or not, he expects us to help for our soul. Matthew 25, it's a judgment matter. The right hand and the left hand is hungry, thirsty, sick and in prison, naked, and a stranger. What do you do with them? So,
yeah. And this is kind of a side, but we often have trouble understanding how the Old Testament is applicable to a New Testament Christians like us. You think, I've talked to many people who name their struggles about, reading the Old Testament, and well, one, it's boring. And two, I think, that's kind of motivated or perpetuated by their, I don't want to say failure, that's a strong word, but there's a disconnect. But if you understand, if you can see in these messages in the Old Testament that God didn't change, his justice, his righteousness is the same all throughout history, all throughout time. And you can find the same principles, you can find the same messages, like you said, in James and First John, in the Gospels. And it's interesting that we find the same thing here in a book like Micah.
Yeah. And you
8th
find grace and
century
mercy in the
BC.
Old Testament too. I mean, you'll find
Yeah,
his loving kindness is firmly to be
yeah,
found there.
yeah.
So he's, like you say, he's the same God.
Right. Right. And human condition didn't change much either, if at all. People still need. People still have needs. People still have physical and mental and spiritual needs. And our mission. And, by the way, we'll talk about this a little bit. Blessing through the people of God, through all the nations.
Mhm.
That's our calling, isn't it? That's our calling, to be a blessing to those around us, not just through the gospel or spirituality per se, but in physical justice and uh, holistic
Yeah,
ministry, if you will. Yeah,
agreed.
just aside, but yeah, I thought that was, yeah. So I mentioned that at the ends of these first two sections, and these are very accusatory. These are harsh, um, and they're very specific. They're pointed. But at the ends of these, and that's for the first one is chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, and for the second section, it's chapter 4, verse 1 through 7. Micah doesn't leave those sections on a negative note. Rather, he brings it together and concludes that section with a positive glimpse of God's hope and his restoration of his remnant. That's a word we're going to see later on. Um, and the two sections, oh, sorry. Yeah. So in chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, after Micah talks about the judgment of God upon his people, he says that God is like a shepherd that will lead the remnant of his people to good pastures and be their king once more. It's almost messianic,
Yeah.
but we all know that this is talking about not just heaven, but also he's talking about the church, right? That is his the New Testament church. That's his remnant, the New Jerusalem, if you will. And in chapter 4, verse 1 through 7, after Micah paints the destruction of Jerusalem temple in the earlier part of chapter 4, or I mean chapter 3, sorry, he says that this destruction is not permanent, right? He makes sure that to point out that this isn't how it ends. God doesn't leave his people destroyed and exiled. Rather, God will build a new Jerusalem and fill its temple, the new temple, with his presence. And again, his remnant, they will be restored. And this new Jerusalem is supposed to be peace on earth, right? And the junction between heaven and earth, through which God becomes the king over all nations. And that's the messianic imagery that we see. Now, the temple does get rebuilt after the exile. That's true. But more symbolically, the temple, it can also refer to the church. It can also refer to his people.
Well, the temple's where the presence of God is, and where Micah is going with this, it seems to me, is that the place where God is going to be is not going to be confined to, certainly not Samaria, it's going to be gone, or even Jerusalem, which would still be around when the church is established. It's going to be established there, and that God is bigger than that. And that's an important, you talk about what can we see from the Old Testament, go to Micah 4 and see
Yeah.
that God's anticipation and his intention was for distant nations. It was for all nations to be able to come into the mountain of the Lord's house. And in fact, I mean, you'll see echoes of this elsewhere in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now we move on to the second half of chapter 4 and 5.
Can I say something
Yeah,
about,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
before we go? Because I really think this is a powerful section that we see echoed in Isaiah 2 and verse 1 through 4,
Mhm.
Daniel 2:44, and Joel 2, which we've already looked at.
Right.
I may be wrong, but it seems to me he is talking about the church that's going to be established and what it's going to be like, as opposed to this real focused prophecy on the two kingdoms, physical kingdoms of Abraham's
Mhm.
descendants. He's looking at judging between many peoples, verse 3, and rendering
Yeah.
decisions for mighty distant nations, hammering their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. What kind of kingdom is this going to be? It's not going to be a military kingdom. It's going to be a kingdom of peace, and
Mhm.
Jesus comes to bring that. And there's going to be a unity in the name of the Lord God forever and ever. Verse 5. So it's in that day, that's when we get to Zechariah. Zechariah uses that phrase oodles of times in the last few chapters of Zechariah to point to the church, the that period of time in which either the ministry of Christ or the establishment of the church. And now I don't think Micah's uh, readers are going to get the full impact of that, or even Micah. That may be Peter's 1 Peter 1:10-12. They're looking for
Yeah.
and wondering what's this all about. But it seems to me that that's what he's intimating. I don't know what you think, but
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And as you get closer to the end of Micah, you keep seeing this, and we'll see this in chapter 4, or the end of chapter 4 and 5.
yeah.
You see this, this imagery of, nope, my video went away. Sorry. This imagery of uh, God's restoration of his remnant, God's restoration of his people. And uh, to these people, they might think, what does that look like? What is God talking about here? They don't know yet, because I mean they haven't even gotten to Assyria yet. They haven't even gotten to the Babylonian exile yet. This is before that. And even for the people who, after the return to um, uh, Jerusalem, return to Israel, after the exile, even those people, they might think, oh, that was talking about the rebuilding of the temple, that was talking about the restoration of those people. Well, even then, not quite yet. Like you go centuries later, and here we are, the New Testament, the church that Jesus bought with his blood, and that represents, God's plan was so much bigger than the confines of those specific events or points in history, and it stretches out even to us. And yeah, and you
They
can
had a
really
future
see that in the
and an
imagery.
ultimate future. There's what's going to happen, and I think the prophets do sometimes deal with the post-exilic period,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
there are
sure.
so many instances where they're pointing to something that they could not see fulfillment of. Even you think post-exilic, they are guests. I mean, this land that they inherited, but
Hmm.
they don't get to control it, rule it. The Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans are the owners of it,
Right.
but they have to go back and settle it. And so this is something that transcends that. That's going to find its fulfillment when Jesus comes.
A double entendre.
Yeah, yeah, dual fulfillment.
Right. Uh, so moving on to the second section of chapter 4, um, and chapter 5. Uh, and Micah prophesies, right, that Assyria will attack and the Babylonians will take Israel into exile, and all of that. But after that, that there will be a restoration, like we've been talking about just now. In chapter 4, verse 6 through 13, Micah prophesies that God will lead his people back to their land and restore them once more. He also prophesies in chapter 5, verse 1 through 6, that this new Jerusalem, this restored nation, city, will be ruled by a new messianic king of the Davidic lineage. And this ruler will come from Bethlehem, and this is where we get the famous prophecy about Jesus being born in Bethlehem, chapter 5, verse 2, Micah. And he will rule over the restored people of God. And this is quoted in Matthew chapter 2, verse 5 and 6. Um, and so here we have God's kingdom, a new kingdom, a restored kingdom. And like you said, it's not quite, I mean, it has some applications in the post-exilic time period, but it's bigger than that. There are applications that are far bigger than that, that applies to us right now.
And just real quick, there, it's interspersed. I mean, there are in before you leave chapter 4, in verse 12, let's see, verse 10. He switches to the present in verse 9. He says, "Now, why do you cry out loudly? Rather than pain, daughter of Zion, going to cry out because you're going to go to Babylon." I mean, that's very clear. And then in verse 12, but he talks about the many nations that have assembled against you, but those nations, do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his purpose, for he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. So Micah says, you're going to Babylon, and then these punishing nations are going, they were just tools to a means to an end, and they're going to be judged, and they're going to face their punishment. So he's not totally ignoring what's about to come. He's trying to show them that your future is more glorious, despite your sin, chapters 1 through 3, than you thought. And so it's not one at the expense of the other. It's beyond this that's going to happen. Something huge is going to happen beyond that will bless everybody.
Everybody. Yep. And again, you see, that's a message of hope.
It is
for a perfect and righteous and just God that had all the right to punish, and in a way he does. In a way, Israel pays for feels the consequences of their actions. But in the end, hope is not lost. In the end, hope is not all gone. There is forgiveness. There is restoration. So, yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, and again, the blessing among all nations. That's obviously, we remember from Genesis chapter 12, God's promise to Abraham. And in chapter 5, verse 7 through 14, we get this image of God's justice will remove evil from his world. So there will be no injustice. There will be no suffering. There will be no, when God restores all things, his good, his righteousness, his justice will prevail.
Right.
And that has an application in terms of eternity, but also, like you said, these people about to be invaded and exiled. It's a message of hope for them too.
That's right.
So lastly, in the last section of chapter 6 through 7, I titled this God's Justice. And the section mirrors, in terms of structure, I believe, the pattern of the first two sections that we talked about. And it's almost like a summary. It's a summarizing conclusion to the whole book. In chapter 6, verse 8, it says, "He has told you, O human, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And I feel like that's the message of Micah. That's God's calling to his people. That's the laws and statutes, or at least the culmination of it, the representation of the entire code of God. And it is to love. It's to be just and to have mercy to your fellow man, and to walk humbly with your God. What more can you do? What more is God asking for them?
Well,
right,
and you think about the fact that they had been doing this other stuff in verse 6 and 7, something that we had passed over just because we can't hit everything in the book.
right,
Back in chapter 3 and verse 11, it says, her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe, her priests instruct for a price, and her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, it's not the Lord in our midst. Calamity will not come upon us. They were doing evil for 6 days a week, and then they would come into the temple and they would cry out to God and say, everything's okay.
yeah,
Jeremiah 5 and verse 30, you have, the people who are living wickedly 6 days a
hmm,
week, and they go, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord are these. We're delivered to do all these things. And, so they were already offering. They already had priests who were leading them. And then Micah says, what should I come before the Lord with? And he's not negating the importance of obedience in following the law. He's saying a lot what Jesus says in Matthew 23. It's he wants you inside out. And you're giving him outside with nothing from your inside. And God rejects that.
yeah,
Seems to me.
yeah. And it's a reminder that the laws that God gave the people of Israel, we often see it as something that's rigid and something that's, really, but
Wrote with that heart. I mean, just
yeah.
express.
So beyond the ritualistic, surface level codes or commandments, there are principles. There are reasons why those things were there, and
Right.
again, God doesn't change. His righteousness, his justice, they stay the same. Just because the old law doesn't apply to us anymore doesn't mean God's righteousness and justice doesn't apply to us. Right? It does. The principle is still there, and that's what, like you said, that's what Jesus was preaching. That's what Jesus taught us in his ministry here. Um, so yeah, and again, what Micah says in chapter 6 verse 8, you know to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Well, the thing is, Israel has not been doing that, right? They've been doing just the opposite, like you pointed out in chapter 3. And Israel's unjust uh, economic practices, like stealing from your neighbor, taking bribes, bending the law, things like that, and their neglect and lack of mercy and compassion for the vulnerable demographic of their society and their community, and even going beyond that, exploitation and taking advantage of the poor and defenseless. And it's a direct rebellion to God's laws and statutes and his principles, his character, his nature. And Micah is saying that that's going to lead to your destruction. That's going to lead to the consequences that you will face very, very soon. And we know that they do. Um, and in chapter 7, verse 8 through 20, uh, this is this is like the last glimpse of hope. Micah personifies Israel as a defeated individual, and I find this section really interesting. Micah personifies Israel as a defeated individual who begs for forgiveness and mercy from God. Right? He's beating his chest, and on his knees, basically. And obviously, this is a representation of Israel in the destruction and exile of powerful foreign powers like Assyria and Babylon. Why should God, at this point, we're asking ourselves as the audience of this book, God's just, God's righteous. He upheld his end of the deal. Like he was not unfaithful to Israel. He was faithful. He was merciful. He loved. He was compassionate. So why should God, after all Israel has done against him, forgive them now? So Micah offers two reasons here in chapter 7, verse 18. Right, it's God's character. His mercy and compassion is far more powerful than his anger and judgment. And though judgment needs to happen because God is just, right? Judgment needs to happen, but that doesn't negate his mercy. That doesn't negate his compassion. Those are still present and available for his people. It reads, chapter 7, verse 18, it says, "Who is a God like you, who forgives sin and pardons rebellion?" Right? And the second is God's promise, his promises to his people, right? God will not just, you know, suddenly abandon the promises that he has made to the forefathers of Israel and the people of Israel in their covenantal relationship.
Right.
It says in chapter 7, verse 20, you will stay true to Jacob and show covenant love to Abraham. Was you, sorry, I think I wrote that down wrong. Chapter 7, verse 20, you will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham as you have sworn to your fathers from the days of old. There you go. Sorry. And again, this is an allusion to the covenant promises God made to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12, 15,
Right.
chapter 17. And wait, were you saying something? I think I cut you.
No, that's okay. And as part of showing who he is and what he wants to do, a couple of great little pieces of imagery here. What does he want to do with our? It says he will have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. I mean, you think about he's stepping on them, crushing them, making them, disappear, or at least he's giving them no attention. And then you have cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. I love those pictures. This is at the end of along with Amos, I think the two hardest messages of the prophets and the minor prophets, who is just, all this inequity and all this unrighteousness from the top down. But what does God still want to do? And I think it's a message our society needs and that we need. I mean, much less that God, because the biggest thing I have run across as a minister almost 30 years that for people is guilt. They cannot forgive themselves. They can't let go of their past. And sometimes there are others who won't let them forget. And that's a problem. But the biggest problem in my experience is people can't let go of it themselves. God saying, in essence, so many different times, I've already forgiven it. I've stepped on it. I've thrown it in the Mariana Trench. You shouldn't be walking around holding on to it. You're negating his power because he says, I have that ability and that desire to do that. And I think a lot of people, if they could let go of that, could begin to grasp what God wants for them and what they could do for God.
Yeah, like when you're so burdened by guilt, like you said at the very end, you can't live for God. You can't. You're so hindered by it. You're tied back, so you can't live to the fullest by the Spirit. You can't live to the fullest for God.
Right.
And
it's not what he wants.
No, it's not. And messages like this is so inspiring. It's so hopeful, because these are people. I mean, usually, when normal everyday Christians, New Testament Christians, think about sin or guilt, you're thinking about personal things, sins that you struggle with. They're not necessarily just outright violations or illegal activities.
Right.
Well, here's God talking about a whole nation that's been that's been so entangled with deep sin. And this isn't just personal or just spiritual or mental sin. These are people actively exploiting their neighbors, stealing from them, and
lifestyle.
Exactly. And yet here's God once again showing mercy, steadfast love, and opportunities for repentance and forgiveness. Sure, you have to pay for your sins. There are negative consequences, and you have to deal with those. Mm-hmm. But God forgives, and when He does, your guilt, it's out of here. You don't have to worry about that anymore. What you have to worry about is, now that you understand that you have done wrong, that you have broken the covenant, and you have violated this relationship with God, that you have to work towards restoration. And I think that's what Micah is calling the people to do. He's not accusing them to bury them under the weight of guilt of their sins, but rather reminding them that you did wrong, so here's how you can make that right. And a reminder that God is willing, that God is still merciful, he still loves. And that's really encapsulated in the last two verses, or last three verses, sorry. Chapter 7, verse 18, 19, 20.
It's almost, you grasp Micah 6, 6 through 8, and embrace Micah 7, 18 through 20. Not only does that help you, I think, appreciate the underlying message of what Micah's saying, that goes a long way in building the right kind of relationship with God, period.
Yeah.
You respond to his grace in the way he says, and you anticipate this great future that includes your complete forgiveness.
Yeah.
That was good. Good Micah stuff.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, just a quick reminder. The last part, Zechariah makes a reference to this, to those of you who are listening, in Luke chapter 1, verse 72, when he's prophesying. He quotes Micah and saying, who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression. So another interesting thing. But yeah, beautiful book, beautiful message, as always.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Well, brother, thank you for your study. Do we got any questions or comments, you think?
Well, it's just Miss Cindy and Miss Kathy. So unless they have a question, and unless you don't have anything else to talk about.
Man, it's great to see you. We miss you around here. I wish the summer didn't end so quick, but I'm excited for you. You're heading to Freed tomorrow, right?
Yes, sir. Yes,
All
sir.
right. Well, we'll pray that everybody's COVID free and that you'll stay that way, and that y'all can have as less a disruptive semester as possible.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No, we're praying for you, and we're proud of you, brother.
Thank you.
We
love you. And I'm praying for Lehman and you and Edwin and everyone, the leadership. There are good things to come, I think. And
I agree. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Hey, and I guess next week you'll be on Central Time again when we do this.
Yeah. I won't be confused.
Hey, man, appreciate you. Thanks for leading the study tonight. It was great.
No problem. Thank you for your input and your chats. Thank you, Miss Kathy. I'll try to have a good year. Hopefully it won't get disrupted by COVID. And yes, I agree, Miss Cindy. It's a great book. And thank you for all your love and all your hugs. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us, everyone else, for watching the recording. And see you next week.
It's a wrap. All right, brother. Take care.
Bye-bye.